Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Greetings from the West Country. Here I am via Zoom again. And thanks to Tar Media in Germany for this wonderful image of two glorious friends here who seem to be communicating quite a lot via email, as just released in the Epstein files, really. And one of them actually has quite strong connections with Cornwall, would you believe? So that's what we're going to get into today is to try and distill exactly how this kind of strange scandal, really, of international relations actually does impact upon grassroots groups and organizing at every level throughout the Western world, really. So let's get into my latest blog this week. I might actually share the screen so you can see some of it because I just think that helps you read it and it helps me read it too. So let's see if I can do that without it all going wrong. Sorry, I'm just finding out all of this as it's going along with me. Oh, there we go. Can you see that? Yes, you can. So the blog this week is called Why the Epstein, ooh, who knows? It's a controversial way to actually pronounce that. I'm not entirely sure myself. Why the Epstein Scandal Matters to Grassroots Organising. Yes, even in Cornwall. So let's get into it. I know the moment you mention Epstein, half the room switches off and the other half assumes you're about to spiral into salacious gossip about decadent royals. Fair enough. There's been no shortage of lurid headlines, often supporting bad faith takes or outright distractions. If you're involved in grassroots organizing, environment, housing, disability rights, local culture, then the Epstein scandal actually matters a great deal, even here in the Duchy of Cornwall, especially down here, in fact. Not because of the sex crimes themselves, horrific as they are. Without sounding flippant, those are not the important part from an organizing perspective. What matters is that the Epstein documents give us a rare, unvarnished look at how power actually functions, not how it claims to function in glossy brochures, mission statements, or charity galas, but how it works when the doors are closed and the theatre stops. So, yeah, let's just really take a moment to digest what I'm on about there. Essentially, I don't want to dissuade people from getting involved in grassroots activism. And this isn't an attack on grassroots activism. If you're passionate about something, I think it's amazing that you're involved in your local environment or your local community. It's something I've always done, and it's something I would always advocate for. However, I understand, having worked with and for, and even or helped organize certain grassroots projects, you essentially come to issues around funding and how you're going to get money. And I think what we're about to get into here is that is where the problems begin. And I mentioned briefly in the blog last week, one of the things that put me off London Pride was the funding structures to that and having to look into that for my job as a researcher and working with the activist Dan Glass. Once you kind of lift the lid on all of this and see the funding structures, you start to get a better picture of why sometimes certain ideas or concerns are not addressed, right? Because that's what quietly, the quiet part is you don't mention certain uncomfortable things in your funding or in your activism. So let's go back, let's share this again. Yeah, bear with me. There we go. Right. What emerges is a class of people who genuinely believe themselves to be above the law, not metaphorically, literally. They trade influence across governments, intelligence agencies, banks, weapons manufacturers, and philanthropic institutions with astonishing ease. The Epstein network shows us that interinstitutional power doesn't operate through democratic accountability. It operates through personal relationship, financial leverage, compromat, and shared class interest. Okay. This is vital for grassroots organizers to understand because so much organizing energy is wasted arguing with the performance of power. We petition the institution. We appeal to its stated values. We take part in consultations that are largely ceremonial. Such processes help cultivate the illusion of participation. Meanwhile, the real decisions are being made elsewhere by people who will never attend a town hall meeting and who don't particularly care what the public thinks. Okay, I'm just going to interject there as well, actually, because I think that's something that I've noticed with a lot of the work I've done everywhere. And it's one of the reasons why I moved away from working with many NGOs or organizations, because there's nothing to do with the people on the grassroots who are involved in these organizations, but the actual structure of the organization limits the discussion. You know, I've noticed this with many HIV charities or NGOs working in that particular field. The funding or the money kind of dictates what you can research, what you can be angry about, what you can bring up in certain situations. That doesn't mean to say that these people are doing things for nefarious reasons necessarily. But what I'm saying is just simply taking that money quietly restricts what your institution can talk about. And I've seen it not just in this country, in places like Laos or Vietnam or Thailand or anywhere that I've worked in refugee centers or those kind of things. Some of the worst people who are the causes of these problems are funding the solutions. And you have to think to yourself, well, why is that necessarily? And I think because it stops a lot of awkward questions being asked, right? It's controlled opposition. And so as a consequence to that, you know, we started Margate Pride, which had different funding structures. So we don't accept corporate money, you know, or I've worked with refugee camps overseas where I've not worked for an NGO or for a charity or whatever. And I've done my own kind of bookings through my own centers. So it's something that we all need to take on board when we're talking about grassroots activism. Okay, let's get back to the blog. I kind of like doing this, even though it's really cold in the studio. It's warming me up doing all of this gyration. This is vital for grassroots organizers to understand because I've just read that paragraph. One of the more sobering elements, and this is where we get into the Epstein thing, one of the more sobering elements of the Epstein story isn't just who he knew, but what moved through his world. Money laundering, arms flows, political interference, even regime change, governments toppled, leaders removed, and vast sums legally washed clean through cultural, educational, and environmental organizations. That should ring bells for anyone who's ever wondered why certain funders always seem to back good causes while working class communities remain neglected. And that's what I wanted to underline with that. I think it's really interesting when you start to look at the Epstein files, just how many philanthropic organizations are involved as well, right? And that's nothing to do with the people working at these institutions, but it shows you the structure of how this global power works and how cynical these people are. Like, they're not really interested in the causes they're funding. They're interested in laundering the money, right? And therefore, perhaps at some point, something in your grassroots organization is going to come up against that. People are still combing through millions of released emails in the US, but already the outline of empire is visible. The Financial Times article on Epstein's banking connections is revealing in this regard. When you trace those networks outward, you don't end up in abstract theory, you end up in very real places. Yes, even Cornwall. Through extracted industries like Imerys and through respected institutions such as wildlife and cultural trusts, this is what global power looks like when it lands locally. So, the same family that profits from extracting Cornwall's mineral reserves also funds organizations that promote greener approaches to resource management, including initiatives linked to the Cornwall Wildlife Trust's Green Recovery Challenge Fund. This does not in itself prove any wrongdoing. However, it does help explain why certain environmental impacts, particularly those linked to mineral extraction, are often absent from official campaigning narratives. This is grassroots theatre in action. The same interests profiting from extraction are also funding the boundaries within which opposition is allowed to operate. And I just want to take a break there to really process and think about that. So, yeah, there's no reference specifically to Cornwall in the email exchanges that I have so far looked at in terms of the Epstein files. However, in talking with members of the Rothschild family, who indeed run Imerys and who indeed fund the Wildlife Trust, for example, and many other cultural and environmental charities and organizations and grassroots agencies throughout Cornwall as well, they talk about the general idea of what they're doing here. They're doing something to offset something else they're doing. And so you get a picture of what's happening here with these different families all around the world. All right. And so that's how it lands locally, right? So, to be clear, the Epstein revelations are often discussed through the lens of particular social or cultural networks, but focusing on identity alone misses the point. What is being exposed is not a uniquely Zionist phenomenon, but a familiar pattern of elite transnational power that has historically operated across Middle European, British, German, Italian, and American ruling classes alike. This is simply how imperial power has reproduced itself. And I want to make that quite clear there, because I think, it's really easy with the Epstein files in particular. You've got a specific example of one piece of the imperial pie, I suppose. And it's the one that's kind of very pro-Zionist. I mean, yes, it does involve certain other sultans and members of Arab royal families throughout the Middle East. But I mean, objectively, it is very clear that most of the people involved in Epstein's circle are incredibly pro-Zionist and pro-Israel, right? And so it would be easy then to just slip into kind of a Zionist, like a Protocols of Zion conspiracy theory, which I don't want to do, because I don't think it is just the Zionists. The Zionists is just one faction of empire. Also relevant to Cornwall, which seems to hide in the background, is the fact that it's a duchy. So it is a feudal territory. It's practically owned by the royal family, right? And as we know from the Panama Papers, they have some very shady financial dealings as well. So this isn't just like a Zionist thing. This is very much Anglo-Saxon, or it could be Catholic, or whatever the institution is. I'm sure very similar relations and operations occur. It's just with the Epstein files, we get one specific look at one specific faction of power and how they function and how they operate. Okay. Crucially, the people working at the grassroots level of charitable, cultural, or environmental organizations are not villains. Most have little to no awareness of the legacies of wealth tied to colonial extraction in regions such as Rhodesia, Palestine, or Somalia, for example. My research suggests these same mechanics operate throughout the provinces, particularly within the overtly feudal Duchy of Cornwall. And I think that kind of gets into what I'm talking about there, from my perspective, and why I'm tying this international scandal to very much local and regional issues, like, for example, Celtic nationalism or the promotion of Cornish or Celtic languages, for example, because I do believe that there's overlap here, because why now? Why suddenly have people been so interested in my Cornish identity? Westminster MPs are coming up out saying that this is the most important thing ever. It's like, at the same time that there's a renaissance in Cornish mineral extraction, because obviously I don't know the specific details, but Imerys has a way of getting lithium through kaolin extraction or whatever. Anyway, long story short, money in them hills again in Cornwall, and all of a sudden MPs are caring about my Cornish identity and my Cornish language. If you trace the money and the funding, it becomes clear why. And also, why are none of these environmental agencies putting out reports on what Imerys is doing? And I think these are very pertinent questions that come directly from this international scandal, because now we see how power functions, right? And we see how institutions work. We should, as grassroots activists, be free to ask these challenging questions and get answers to those questions. Okay. And just moving on here. This is why outlets like the True Anon podcast and the Grey Zone matter. They've been doing the unglamorous work of tracing these connections through a historical materialist lens rather than dismissing them as scandal or conspiracy. They remind us that power has a history, a geography, and a balance sheet. If grassroots organizing is going to be effective, it has to be grounded in reality, not the comforting story we're told about how the world works, but the uncomfortable truth of how it often does. The Epstein scandal isn't a distraction from local issues. It's a brutal lesson in why local struggles are always connected to global systems of power. As always, Miath Ka. Okay, I put links in the section below to some of the articles I've referenced, and I think it would be really interesting to get some feedback here. Like I said, this is just a blog, these are just ideas. And really, the more research you put into following the money, it's the old thing of then I think that brings up some uncomfortable questions about certain culture war issues or cultural issues, right? That people are getting angry about. Why are people, for example, in Cornwall, so angry about their Cornish identity or Cornish devolution or Cornish nationalism? And they're not kind of angry about the fact that a couple of families, namely the royal family and the Rothschilds, seem to be kind of full steam ahead on resource extraction and funding any kind of environmental agency so that they don't ask questions about what Imerys is actually doing. But anyway, I think it's worthwhile raising that subject. I could be completely wrong, but I'm definitely seeing kind of how power functions and translating that from like local grassroots movements into more an international sphere. And I hope that's helped some people see that. Any ideas, put them in the comments below. I'll always answer any messages or emails that you send. So thanks very much for taking the time. I'm off to go and do something fun, and I hope you are too. And I will look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Bye.